You'll remember that the rise of New Wave at the end of the 1970s was a really signal event in the sense that it helped really define the end of the decade as one that was pushing back and maybe even rejecting the values of the hippie aesthetic that I've argued really sort of unifies a lot of rock music from about the mid-60s to the end of the 1970s. So the question would be, what happens with New Wave as it works its way into the 1980s? Well, it turns out that a lot of groups who used New Wave was defined in many ways by sort of not only turning to the past, in what I termed as a kind of ironic way, or maybe a detached way would maybe be a better a way of thinking of it. That is, turning to the past, not because you want to go back to the past, but because you're using the past because you know your audience understands what that is, so it's all kind of in quotation marks and distance from your own personal values or intentions, that kind of thing. So whenever we saw these artists at the end of the 1970s using music of the kind of pre-hippie era, they all kind of got lumped in together as kind of New Wave. And so some artists were not using the past ironically at all. They weren't, maybe reminding people of that or trying to disabuse them of the notion, because that's kind of what was selling at the time. But as the 80s unfolded, you really get a lot of these artists sort of separating out into a continuation of the New Wave, which by the time you get to the early 80s, New Wave really sort of blended in to mainstream rock and was no longer such a rebellious thing. I mean, it had its moment of negative definition, here's what we aren't. But after sort of going a couple years of that, it really pretty much got to the point where you could hear the Cars and Foreigner and Boston and Talking Heads all pretty much together on classic rock radio in the early 1980s. There wasn't seen to be a lot of difference, maybe difference in emphasis, but not difference in kind when it came to style. So you got those groups, the continuation of New Wave, and then you got the ones who had been using the past not in an ironic way, really were celebrating earlier music because they thought the hippie thing had gone too far, it had gotten too complex. It was time to get back to roots and really make the music more authentic and more real because it got back to its roots again. And I'm going to call these groups the New Traditionalists. That is a kind of return to the past, a return to the tradition, in the same ways that you have jazz traditionalists or folk traditionalists or country traditionalists, right? People who want to get back to the roots and have respect for the roots of the tradition. And leading the parade, I think, with the New Traditionalists is Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. Tom Petty, as I said when we were talking about New Wave, really always wanted his group to sound like pretty much like an updated version of the Byrds. He wasn't doing it ironically. He wasn't doing it to make some sort of, critical statement about society or anything like that. That's just the way he thought good music should sound. So he delivers a vocal, his vocal style is very much influenced by Dylan, and there's a lot of sort of jingly, jangly guitars, pop hooks, 3-4 minute songs. He really believes in the tradition of mid-60s American rock and roll, and so that's really kind of what he goes back to. Representative recordings to hear this are the album Hard Promises from 1981, featuring the song The Waiting. There's Southern Accents from 1985, which features the song Don't Come Around Here No More. And then Tom's first solo album, Full Moon Fever from 1989, which features the song Free Fallin'. You literally cannot go to see Tom Petty live these days without hearing at least 2 of those 3 songs. They're such iconic tunes for Tom Petty in the 1980s, and having videos to go along with them. In fact, on one of the videos, Tom Petty is dressed as the Mad Hatter, and he's cutting a cake where Alice from Alice in Wonderland is the cake, and he's cutting the cake. It's very sort of surrealistic, and people would come up to him in airports and say, "Hey, I know you. I saw you on MTV." And Tom Petty and Heartbreakers at that point were like, "MTV? What's this MTV?" They had a video on MTV. They'd never even seen MTV. So in those early days of MTV, there were a lot of artists who were even started to be promoted on MTV who still hadn't even seen the channel yet. This gets back to our idea of the spread of MTV according to the spread of the cable television industry. Another guy who has to be thought of as a New Traditionalist, and an important one, is Bruce Springsteen. Bruce, we talked about as a singer-songwriter in the 70s, but as it goes on, it turns out that Bruce really is kind of a rootsy, New Traditionalist kind of guy into the 1980s and above. He really really is a return to simplicity, return to the past, maybe even a kind of, in some ways, a kind of a romantic view of what authenticity was to be somebody in the 60s, you know, growing up in New Jersey and this kind of thing. The image of an average working class guy who just talks good sense, this kind of image. The big album for him in the 70s we talked about before was Born to Run from 1975. In 1980, there are albums in between, but the big #1 album from 1980 was The River, which features the song Hungry Heart. But the big one from the 1980s is this album, Born in the USA, #1 in 1984, 6 top 10 hits, including Born in the USA and Glory Days. Both of those tunes become radio staples. And Bruce Springsteen becomes one of the biggest bands of the 1980s. Again, with tons of video on MTV to support it. Interesting between Tom Petty and Bruce Springsteen. Tom Petty, I think it was the Live Aid concert, said that he was going on, they were going on just before Bruce Springsteen, and Tom Petty, who's got a very sort of sardonic sense of humor, said that, I think it was Bob Geldof, came to him backstage and said, now if you hear them when you're playing, if you hear people saying, you think they're booing you, they're not booing you, they're just yelling, Bruce, because Bruce Springsteen was going to come after him. And Tom Petty says, well, what's the difference? Right? So again, that kind of biting irony coming from Tom Petty. But anyway, this gives us some sense of the new traditionalist sort of thing. We'll talk a bit more about that with regard to groups on both sides of the Atlantic now that were not only new traditionalists, but sort of really embraced a kind of an Americana. Americana, the sort of idealistic idea of what America is and what some people would call flyover country, that kind of basic sort of good sense, wheat-fed, idea of America that maybe in some ways probably doesn't really exist. It's just an ideal, like the idea of New York City as being the films that we see in the Woody Allen movies. That New York doesn't really exist. When you go to New York, you're bound to be a little bit disappointed in some ways because it doesn't appear just the way it's romanticized in those films. But let's talk a little bit about some of these Americana groups. We're going to talk about John Mellencamp, who went under the name of John Cougar Mellencamp, and then finally John Mellencamp, coming out of Indiana, really projects the image of a small-town Midwesterner. Had a hit in 1979 with I Need a Lover, at least it was a radio hit, was covered by Pat Benatar. She had a hit with it. But a representative example for John Cougar Mellencamp would be his album American Fool, a #1 album from 1982, and the two songs Hurt So Good, a #2 hit, and Jack and Diane, a #1 hit. In many ways, John Cougar Mellencamp, we talk about him in terms of Americana in the 80s, but it might be just as easily to think about him as a kind of singer-songwriter fronting a band in that kind of way. But here, I'm thinking of him as a kind of a traditionalist, embracing older values as we get farther and farther away from the 60s and the hippie thing. Now it's about returning to the values of good, simple, direct music. Coming from the UK, another group that was doing that kind of things is Dire Straits, fronted by Mark Knopfler, a great guitar player, a wonderful singer, voice sounding very much in the kind of Bob Dylan tradition in the way that he kind of intones the lyrics, and using what was, at the end of the 70s, kind of a novel approach. He was playing a Fender Stratocaster guitar, a particular kind of electric guitar with a very clean kind of sound that really emphasized the Stratocaster sound. Anybody hearing that, a guitar player hearing that, would say they would know exactly what kind of guitar that was. It was so different than the cranked up, distorted Marshall stacks and various kinds of things that were happening in rock. To hear this very clean guitar sound on a song like 1978's Sultans of Swing really defined Dire Straits as a group that was really going back more to roots and bypassing a lot of the sort of heavy rock of the day. Well, they didn't bypass it forever. The album Brothers in Arms, #1 album from 1985, features the song Money for Nothing, which has got plenty of distorted guitar, but still a kind of an embrace of not only American roots music, but also a kind of a a criticism of music merchandising, which ironically, the video for this song that was criticizing music merchandising went into heavy rotation on MTV, which of course at that time was all about music merchandising. It features Sting on background vocals at the very beginning saying, "I want my MTV," and then they launch into the song that's about music merchandising, which seems to be a criticism of merchandising groups through MTV, and it becomes a hit on MTV and gets played over and over again. To continue the story now of New Wave and how it sort of merged into mainstream rock in the 1980s, we continue the story of the Police. We talked about them in the last video. Their sophisticated musical arrangements that use poetic and intellectual lyrics. Maybe the best representative example of their period in the first half of the 1980s is the album Synchronicity, a #1 album in 1983, taking its title from the psychological, quasi-philosophical, quasi-sometimes mystical writing of Carl Jung. The two big songs off that album, Every Breath You Take, a #1 hit, and King of Pain, a #3 hit. Following, as the career of the Police is beginning to die down, you get the rise of the career of a young group from Dublin called U2. Again, simple songs, but simple songs arranged in very innovative kind of ways, featuring Bono on lead vocals, who's since become a fantastic celebrity in his own right, a real pursuer of social causes and a voice of, I think he would say, a voice of conscience in the world, trying to use his fame to create positive change. And the distinctive guitar sounds of The Edge, who in many ways created a kind of guitar sound that became the signature for a lot of that first batch of U2 music. Not unlike the way Andy Summers created a particular kind of guitar sound for so much of the Police music that preceded it. So in many ways, I see the movement from the Police to U2 as being kind of sort of stage one and stage two of very similar kinds of approaches to their music, even though they're very distinctive bands, and you would never confuse the music of one for the music of the other. The big U2 album from the 1980s has to be The Joshua Tree, a #1 album in 1987, produced by Brian Eno and Daniel Lanois. It's an interesting thing about U2, the producers had a lot of control over how the music would go, but that wasn't because they were being dominated by the producers, it's because it's the way U2 liked to work. Lots of times they would go into the studio, they would jam, they would come up with ideas, they would leave, the producers would go through the ideas, they would find the best ones, they would edit them together, the group would come in, they'd say, "How do you like this? Oh, that sounds pretty good, let's do it this way, or let's try it another way," or something like that. And so there was a real interaction between the group providing a lot of kind of raw material, in the studio, and the producers going back and sorting through it and sort of putting it together and helping to sort of craft it into the tunes as they developed. And so again, a very influential group who went on after the 80s to be one of the biggest rock bands in the world. Maybe the most important song from that album, The Joshua Tree, is With or Without You, a #1 hit again for U2 in 1987. In the next video, let's turn our attention to new acts that use old styles, and also to Blue-Eyed Soul, to help round out a bit of our discussion of some of the MTV bands from the 1980s.